I'm your host, Jack, your failure connoisseur, and today my guest is Jess Rosenberg. Jess is an obscenely talented individual. She is a design and creative leader, designer, manager, ideas person with 18 plus years of experience helping brands tell their stories in differentiated and breakthrough ways. You may know her because she was the director of brand design and creative at Webflow. She scaled the brand studio team from 8 to 18 in under 2 years. And she expanded the team's functions from just brand design and Webflow development to also include copywriting, video creative, non-web creative, and creative operations. So if you were at one of the Webflow conferences during the time Jess was there, she was heavily involved in the creative at that time, obviously. She's worked at Twitter, Cloudflare, Mural, Webflow, and other amazing brands. So her ideas and leadership have influenced many tools and products you use today, which is wild. And she's just launched a podcast called Ladies Who Create, which is excellent. She's had Grace Walker. She's had Good Side Studio, who we had on recently. So you know it's a good podcast. Basically, she's a big deal. But has she always been a big deal? Has it been a smooth ride to where she is today? You guessed it, guys. No. The failures that we'll talk about today are her desire to be liked by everyone. When she became a manager leader, her imposter syndrome almost crippled her. And the third failure is companies expecting leaders to not be hands-on and in the work when she was very much that type of character. Jess, welcome to the Webflow podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I am stoked. I believe that's what someone in the States would say. I'm stoked to have you here. And
I'm just as stoked to be here. Yes, a lot of people in the States do say that word.
Yeah, it feels really odd for me to say it, but I find sometimes I have American guests and then I'll use these weird words and I'm like, what am I saying that for? So I feel like I should preface that by saying that. I'm going to stop talking. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with failure.
That's an excellent question. I used to be really scared of failure earlier on in my career, even in university and high school, early days. I think there was this massive pressure to succeed and be really good at everything. I went to a really competitive high school, even more competitive university program in design, and the bar was always so high. And so the thought of failure honestly terrified me for a really long time. I think it was when probably like right before I became a manager, I was still at design IC. I learned to embrace failure and actually welcome it and welcome it quickly because I found that failure was the greatest tool for learning and improving and getting better. And so, failed a ton earlier in my career as a designer, and when I did feel like I was failing, it would honestly shake me and I didn't know how to deal with it or overcome it. But somewhere deep down in my subconscious and my brain, I would learn to calibrate those failures into learnings. And that's something that I tried to get better and better at as I became more and more experienced. And especially as a manager and a leader of teams, I wanted to be able to fail fast. That way I could grow even faster and get better and better at what I did. So now my relationship to failure is one of embracing it, honoring it, learning from it, and on the teams that I lead, trying to champion failure as long as we use it as a tool to improve and get better and, recognize where our strengths are and where we can generally be improving. And also recently, over the past year, I've been taking improv comedy classes. And on the first day of class, this is something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. We were all just like doing these weird improv exercises for the first time. And, people were messing up and stumbling. And my teacher, he wanted to make it super clear that in this class, like, there is no perfectionism. We're here to learn. We're here to just like live in the moment. And he's like, I want everyone to actually celebrate failure. So if you feel like you're stumbling or you do something you think is wrong, he's like, I want everyone to pause and I want you to say, I failed. And then I want everyone else in the class to like start clapping for you and celebrating you. And I was like, that is so cool. And from then on, really, it was recently, the past year, whenever I've come across little failures here and there, I'll now pause and be like, okay, like, you failed. Let's like pause and celebrate that and then move on and go on to the next thing. But I just thought that was so awesome, just to actively celebrate failure in that way.
That's a beautiful idea. I think this idea of, pushing your comfort zones, I feel like stand-up comedy is like the ultimate version of that. I mean, trying to make people laugh, strangers laugh, is just in my head like the scariest thing. Like, to go on stage with just a random bunch of people and try and make them
Mm-hmm.
laugh, I think is just a terrifying concept. And the whole idea of pushing your comfort zone, I think, is when you will fail, like when you are literally outside of your comfort zone, your zone of what you feel safe, and you feel safe because you know how to do it, right? And then this idea of pushing your comfort zone and being accepting and loving of yourself when you do inevitably mess up, because you are literally outside of your comfort zone. You haven't done that thing before, which is why you feel uncomfortable. And I think it's such an important message for people that listen to the podcast to receive, because someone of your caliber has not got to where you are by being afraid of failing. You literally cannot have done all the things you have done, led the teams you have, and worked at the companies you have without being like, I'm going to just have a go, learn from it, iterate as I go, and learn from every single experience as an opportunity to become more successful the next time you try, rather than try and like succeed off the bat. Do you resonate with that idea? I'm just so proud of you, Jess.
Oh, thanks. That's so kind. I do resonate with that. I think it's taken a lot of, honestly, like, I did leadership coaching for many years, which really helped me get out of my head. And I would beat myself up over the failures constantly. I was so hard on myself, and I had such a high bar for myself that whenever I felt like I was failing, it crippled me. I felt just so terrible. And this goes into the whole wanting to be liked, but also wanting to do a good job. And, am I being a good leader? Am I showing up in all the best ways I possibly can for the company and the team? And, if any little thing went wrong, it would literally cripple me. And so therapy and, leadership coaching, and also having a really strong support system of mentors that I've been really fortunate to have throughout my career really helped me step outside of my head and tackle the failures with logic versus only emotion, which for a long time I felt like I was doing.
It's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of the best creatives that I've had on this podcast, whether they're developers or designers, they are very in tune with their emotions. And I think that's what makes them so good at what they do, which is, one frame to look at that. But then I think on the other side, they take criticism really heavily. They feel everything, and they might associate the criticism of their work with a criticism of themselves. And then you talked about beating yourself up. I mean, this is quite a hard question, but how would you advise someone who's maybe like, God, I really resonate with this. I beat myself up. I don't know how to get out of my own head. What advice would you give to someone who's listening who really resonates with that idea?
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard. I think it takes a lot of reflection and just stillness to reflect on the situation and what's happening. And a lot of the time, at least for me personally, I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, I had to keep reminding myself that, if there's criticism on my work or how I'm showing up at work, it's not a personal attack on my character. It's feedback around either performance or, the work itself. And so just understanding that distinction, it's like no one's attacking your character, no one's saying you're a bad person, and making sure that you're separating those two things, because that's super important. I see a lot of creatives blend. We tend to blend everything anyway, because creative people, it's really hard to separate our professions from who we are, because it is who we are in a lot of ways. And I think that's why criticism tends to feel so personal. So just pausing and understanding that, that sort of criticism isn't about you as a person. It's likely about the work. It's likely about your performance, and trying to activate that logical part of your brain to really understand that and see it as feedback to improve. And I think that's really hard sometimes too, because when we tend to get feedback, I think our emotional ego side of the brain will flare up and be like, they hate me. Everything's awful. Like, I'm never going to succeed. But in reality, it's like, okay, let's let's feel those things for a moment and then step away and understand what the actual feedback is. And does that make sense? Is that feedback worth listening to and actioning on? Because sometimes we'll receive feedback that it's okay to not agree with. And I've received feedback throughout my career, and it wasn't easy to do at first, but in, like, for example, 360 performance reviews, which is something that a lot of companies do internally. You'll receive feedback from your peers, from your manager, you'll get yourself feedback, you'll get feedback from your direct reports. And it's important to understand which feedback amongst all of that feedback is what you want to listen to and action on in ways that you know will help you grow. And to separate the feedback where you're like, I don't actually agree with that, but I'll listen to it, and, thank you for sharing it. So having that understanding, I think, is super important in deciding where you want to grow as a person. It's like when someone gives design feedback on a project. Let's say a whole group of people are giving design feedback, and maybe it's folks from across the entire organization. A designer can't implement every single person's piece of feedback, because then you'll just end up with a hodgepodge output, right? So same goes for, I think, feedback on your performance and how you show up at work. It's important to decide which feedback to action on to create the best version of yourself in the end.
Wise words. Okay. So the first thing that you mentioned there was sitting with whatever criticism it is, and just not necessarily like going into an emotional state, even though it is a difficult thing to listen to criticism, and then separate your work from yourself, your ego, and make sure that you kind of try and be as objective as possible to understand the difference between those two things. And then also understand the other person, where that other person's criticism is coming from, because it might not even be, that helpful to listen to that feedback, or not to listen to it, but to action upon it, maybe is a better phrase. Because I think it's healthy to hear whatever the feedback is from whoever it is, maybe in your team or client, and then decide whether that's fair feedback or feedback that you want to actually implement changes to or not. But that's really, really helpful advice there. So can I ask you a little bit about the difference between being a designer and a creative to being a leader? Because I don't know if this is fair, but you strike me as someone who's like a quiet leader. There's obviously different styles of leadership. There's this kind of macho leader who kind of just tells people what to do. It's my way or the highway. There's leaders that are very emotionally intelligent, super hands-on, and, want to learn the names of their, team's partners and their kids. And, is a very much wanting to see the whole person to be the leader that they want to be. But can you tell me a little bit about how you transition from being a designer and being a creative thinker to the leadership role, and how you had to change to do that?
Yeah, for sure. It was hard. I had this preconceived notion that leaders had to be loud. And you're right, I'm not a loud leader. I'm definitely, I won't say quiet, but I'm reserved. I'm very observant. I do want to get to know the people on my team and their partners and their families, and that's just how I am. But when I first made the transition, I think what I struggled with most was not having a clear expectation of what I was responsible for. And there was this delineation of, okay, you're now managing and leading people who are designing the work, and then you're not doing that as much anymore. And so I felt this immense anxiety around, how's my performance going to be measured now that I'm not designing and I'm not as hands-on? And it took me a really long time, many years, to learn what that meant. But at first it was really challenging, and I had zero experience managing people in their careers. And so that was something that took a long time and a lot of failures and stumblings to figure out. But at the end of the day, it really came down to understanding people, connecting with people, and meeting them where they're at. And I think one of the biggest learnings for me earlier on as a people manager was that not every person can be managed the same. And there's different levels of experience of people on the team, different people have different personalities. They have different needs from you as a leader and a manager. And so that took me quite a bit of time to understand that I had to kind of tweak my involvement and my style and how I showed up with the different people on my teams. And I actually really enjoyed that because while I am on the quieter side and I'm not as loud and maybe boisterous as some other folks might be, I really enjoy getting to know people, especially creative people on a personal level. And so it became very rewarding for me very quickly to form close bonds with the people on my team, understand where they were skill set wise, how I could help them and mentor them and help them grow as designers. And so that in itself, felt like a different sort of challenge for me, aside from being hands-on designing, that really surprised me, and I never thought I would enjoy as much as I did when I first went into leadership.
I guess it's a very creative thing to, be a leader, even if you're not necessarily like on the tools as much, as it were. The different personality types, the same type of understanding of people, and different inputs and outputs, and how
Yeah.
You react is going to change how other people react. And I think a lot of those skills are very transferable from being a designer to a leader. And I don't want to say the word quiet lightly, or like as if that puts you down. Just to be clear, I think there's huge strength in leaders that are more reserved. And I think when quieter people that I'm around, or quieter leaders that I've had in the past, quiet is the wrong word, more reserved leaders that I've had in the past do speak, their words carry a greater weight. My mum never swears, but when she swears, I've heard it twice in my life. I know that I need to go to my room. Or that this was back when she, I heard her swear, and I was like, okay, she means business. I need to get out of here. And I think vice versa, in the context of leaders, that when they really do want an idea to be heard by people, and share that to a team, it's really, really powerful. So I'm not trying to say that macho leaders are more powerful and maybe more reserved leaders are less. I just think it's a different type of communication style, which, like you say, appeals to some people more than others, depending on their stage and how they respond to leadership. Can I change gear a little bit and ask you about the different companies that you've worked at? You told me before the podcast that you're now slowing down the pace a little bit, although I don't really understand that, because you've just launched a podcast and you seem insanely active and busy on social medias and stuff. But can you tell me a little bit about where you're at now? You've worked at all these companies, you've got awards, you're just like, well, I've done it all, or have you done it all, and what does success look like for you now?
I definitely haven't done it all. I've done a lot for sure. I think for me, success looks like, I love the build stage of a company where I'm able to come in early-ish on and build teams and help build the brand. And when the companies are small enough to for me to have that sort of impact. And whenever I'm in those modes, I'm so fulfilled. And it has to be with the right types of people, the right type of company. But there's definitely memories that I have at some of the past recent companies I've been at where for a while I was just like, this is it. This is what success feels like. It's working with creative people, building things together towards a shared mission. And that is what I love doing. And so right now I am slowing down, which again, who knows what that means for me, but I'm actually starting a new job very soon. I'm not going to share yet where, but I'm trying to enjoy the downtime as much as I can before starting a new job I'm really excited about, where I will be joining an earlier stage company and helping to build and doing all the things that I love doing. So for the next week or so, I'm going to relax as much as I possibly can, as much as I know how, before going into build mode again.
Okay, awesome. A nugget dropped on the podcast. Amazing.
A nugget.
A nugget. Exclusive. Okay, so can I ask you a little bit about, okay, you seem like you could retire, or at least live pretty chill. You could do freelance work. You could do the odd bit of consultancy, I'd imagine. I imagine you get those types of requests quite often. And instead, you're like, you know what? I don't want to be a single Pringle freelancing or consulting. You want to be in a team and you want to work with others. And that seems to be a very intentional, conscious decision for you. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in this particular situation, the company and team that I'm joining was a very specific company and team that came along where I was like, I can't, I need to do this. Like, this is calling me on so many levels. And so I think it was just the uniqueness and, the specificity of the role in the company. If that hadn't shown up on my radar, I probably would have continued like pursuing freelance and being a single Pringle, as you put it, which I love. But, I think, and throughout my career, I've been fortunate to have worked at companies that really resonate with me from a mission standpoint. Like at Twitter, I had been a Twitter power user since like 2007, since they first launched. And that was a really special company to join because of that. And then, Mural and Webflow, similar, like both companies whose missions I can really relate to and champion. And so when a company like that comes up as an opportunity for me, I get really excited. And it's exciting enough for me to want to commit my full efforts to it.
So, success to you is working in a team which you can have a massive impact in and help shape not only the company's trajectory but also the people that are working with you and alongside you. Is that, have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, yeah, and having fun. Like having fun is such a big part of it for me. And my fondest memories of where I've worked in the past have been on teams where we're able to just have a really good time while we're doing the work. And I have so many great memories of like the team at Webflow and at Mural and even at Twitter. And I'll be close with those people I know for the rest of my life because we had so much fun together. And I think the work and the output shows that we did. So a lot of success for me is doing really impactful and important work, but also having fun while doing it.
Awesome answer. Very important to say. I was just like going down this kind of, so you want to be fulfilled and stuff. And you're just like, no, I also just want to have fun, Jack.
I want to have a good time and make some cool shit,
Yeah, make cool shit. I love that. So you're doing what you want to do. It sounds like, you're at success almost, like you're doing work that you want to do. You're about to start this new job, super exciting. But it hasn't always been easy, has it, Jess? And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this
Right.
episode. Are you ready for the first
I'm
failure?
ready.
Okay.
I'm ready. Let's do this.
All right, then. Tell me about failure number one, your desire to be liked by everyone.
Yes. I still struggle with this. I consider myself to be an empath. Think I'm a kind person. And, working on in house teams, especially as a people manager and leader, I've often been in situations where I'm like, okay, I can do what's best for the business, quote unquote, best for the business, or I can do what's best for the individual. And ideally, oftentimes, those are the same thing ideally. But a lot of the times they're not. And that's where I feel so personally conflicted. And also, when earlier on in my career, in my management career, when it came time to giving feedback and hard feedback, I felt like I didn't have the tools to deliver clear and helpful feedback to people that didn't come off as hurtful. Because as you said, creatives especially are sensitive. And I earlier on, I didn't have the communication skills to deliver feedback in a radical candor type of way. And there's a term called ruinous empathy, which essentially means you're not giving the person the feedback they deserve to hear because you're scared you're going to hurt their feelings. So instead, you're just really nice and you say that everything's okay. And for a while, that was me. And I felt myself inside, my gut was like, that is not the right thing to do. Like, this person deserves the feedback so they can grow. But I was just so scared they weren't going to like me. And, once I started flexing those muscles and practicing the communication tools and delivering hard feedback with people, it was hard. And I think a lot of people definitely gave me feedback back that I wasn't being kind or that I was too direct or the way that I shared the feedback wasn't great. And they're probably right because I was learning and I didn't have the tools in my tool belt to deliver, the words in a way that was both clear, direct, but also empathetic and kind. It's a really hard balance to strike. And sometimes I feel like I don't even do it well these days. But at the end of the day, I learned just how important it is to, it's like, it's actually not being kind if you're withholding from giving feedback that is clear. And that was the lesson I learned. And wanting to be liked, I was actually like, wait, this person deserves to hear this. Hopefully that they can understand that I'm doing this out of kindness and love and wanting them to improve. And eventually I would even just say that and preface it with, I've got some feedback for you. Are you open to it? If so, great. Learning people's preferences for how they want to receive feedback, I learned, is super important. Some people get really uncomfortable in a live conversation and they prefer written feedback. And so that was a big learning as well. And so really just like tuning into, this goes back to like individual needs depending on the different people on the team and their styles and everything, just like understanding what people's preferences were and catering to that, and just tapping into all of the empathetic ways that I've learned over the years. And now I'm rambling and I digress. But
Can I just highlight some of the things that you've said, just so I'm very clear? So there's this beautiful phrase that you used: ruinous, choosing ruinous empathy over radical candor. So essentially trying to bubble wrap the person that you need to give more direct feedback to in order to help them grow and develop as an individual. But that grow and develop as an individual, that advice or that feedback or that direction might be received in such a way that, pisses them off and makes them defensive perhaps. And instead of choosing that potentially confrontational conversation, you kind of sugarcoat the advice, or maybe don't quite actually say what you mean in a direct way. But actually, and I don't know if this is maybe what you were finishing off saying, but oftentimes that affects you because you're withholding information, which feels incredibly uncomfortable, I found. And also, if you don't say that, then you can't really help that person. Even though it might hurt initially, they need to hear that in order for them to grow. So you're not helping you or them by not having that potentially confrontational conversation. So have I understood you correctly?
Yeah, totally. Yes. It was withholding helpful information out of fear of being disliked.
I actually had a very strange date where this girl said to me, first date, she said, "Do you want to have kids?" And I knew, because she'd spoken about her nieces and nephews for the last 20 minutes, that she wanted, it was quite clear that I needed to say, yes, I want to have kids in order for this date to carry on, because it was clearly a big deal for her. And it was really hard to say, I'm really not sure where I stand with kids. I don't think I want to have kids at least for 10 years. So if your plan is to have kids and that's a non-negotiable for you, then totally fair. Have a good life. Maybe we're not compatible type thing. And it was so difficult to say, even to a complete stranger that was just sitting across from me. Like, it's ridiculous to imagine the levels that you would go to speak to a teammate that you've worked with for years and say, look, this isn't good work. And here's why. And here's what you need to learn in order to improve. Like, just saying that to a stranger, like just kind of being truthful to a stranger is hard, even when you think that it might be a confrontational situation. So I completely
in your
resonate.
situation, it sounds like that was kind of probably like a bit of a surprise question too for you. Did you feel like you were like, whoa, I did not see that one coming?
I think on a first date, there's kind of like not social rules, but like social expectations maybe. You kind of do the warm up of like, the regular questions. And maybe that question I didn't expect on the first date. But I was actually really grateful that she did ask that, because she knew what she wanted. She knew what she wanted from me. And I knew where I stood off the back of that. And initially, I think I was a bit like, whoa, where did that come from? But also, on reflection, I actually think it was seriously helpful because, I understood where she stood, which meant that I could kind of react from that, which goes on to say, which I'm trying to kind of circle back to you, is that even though there is potentially conflict when you get quite direct feedback, which could be perceived as negative by the other person, actually, in the long run, it does help them. And it's so important to recognize that. I think if anyone's listening and is like, I've really got to have that confrontational conversation with my client
Yeah.
about scope creep or, pay, that
Right.
you've started a project expecting them to pay and they haven't paid and they're just like, oh yeah, I'll pay you next week. And it's like, no,
Totally.
you need to have, set those boundaries to basically train their expectations to a certain extent. And
Yeah. And having the verbal tools and knowing how to structure those types of feedback conversation is really hard. Like I mentioned, I did leadership training, coaching rather. And one of the frameworks I learned in leadership coaching was called the situation behavior impact matrix or framework. And now with chat gpt, and I still do this, I'm like, okay, I need to give some hard feedback. I'll go into chat gpt and be like, give me a situation behavior impact framework for how to deliver this type of feedback, and then it'll spit it out, and then I'll practice, it'll help me practice saying it out loud. And it takes a lot of practice, and I think scripting and writing and learning how to deliver feedback in that sort of framework type of way to get good at it. But I have found that specific framework helps to remove subjectivity out of the feedback, because you're focusing on the situation, describing that, the behaviors that were involved, and then the impact that it had in order to deliver feedback that can stick and produce better outcomes next time.
can you repeat the name of that framework? Situational impact framework, was that it?
Situation behavior impact,
Okay.
SBI.
Okay, great. So if anyone struggles with confrontational conversations, have a look at that framework. I've literally just looked it up now and I'm like, oh my God, thank God we had this conversation, because this is something that I'm struggling with too. And there's a framework which will help us practice conversations before having them. So that's really, really helpful. Thank you, Jess. Can we move on to failure number 2? Your
Yes.
imposter syndrome.
Yeah. It's still there from time to time. It kind of peeks its little head and reminds me it's hanging around. But yeah, early on, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like it's come in waves throughout my career. And when I became a manager for the first time, it was so intense because I really didn't know what I was doing. I had to learn on the job. I knew how to be a designer. I just didn't know how to lead people. And so my imposter syndrome was very much like, you don't know how to do this. And I didn't. And it's really interesting to think about because the times that imposter syndrome has shown up since then, remembering those first experiences as being a manager and a leader and having it show up is such an important reminder, because when it does show up now, I know that that's usually to signal that there's a gap in my knowledge or experience. And it won't show up for no reason. And I try and listen to it as feedback, as information, and really try and internalize, like, okay, why am I feeling this way? Is it because I have a gap in a skill set, or do I have a gap in experience in some way, shape, or form? And then I'm able to quickly identify, like, maybe I think I do, and I want to get better at it and practice it. That way, next time I'm faced with a situation, the imposter syndrome isn't so overwhelming and loud. And that's typically the case. There are times, however, throughout my career where the imposter syndrome pops up and it's totally false and silly, and my monkey brain just like coming at me. And those times I have to remember I do have experience. I do know what I'm doing. I'm good at this. And so knowing what the difference is, there's two different flavors of imposter syndrome, almost, at least for me. And one of them, this is very meta, but it's like the imposter syndrome. And then it's the imposter syndrome that is actually giving me information on areas that I need to improve. Does that make sense?
I love that. Okay, so I think sometimes people talk about imposter syndrome as this crippling thing where they actually do know what they're doing, but the imposter, this imposter syndrome turns up. It's like this little parrot on their shoulder who's just saying, you can't do that. Who do you think you are? And stuff. But then there's the imposter syndrome where you feel out of your depth because you do not know what you need to know in order to do the job. And it's super important to recognize which of those two it is, because I felt this as well, where, you might be like, oh, it'll be fine, I'll work it out. Actually, maybe you need to study up before doing that client meeting. Maybe you need to speak to someone who's done this before to understand the process of, I don't know, whatever it is, like a CMS migration or whatever.
Right.
There's stuff that you actually are an imposter because you literally you haven't done the thing. Like,
Totally.
so it's super important to differentiate between those two things. And I really love your definition. So it's important to work out those two. But
Totally.
you did have the experience. You did know what you were doing, and you just had this fear that you might mess up, or you didn't actually know what you were doing. And then how did you, like, for those people, when you've got imposter syndrome, when you're like, wait, this is dumb, I've done this before, like I know how to do this, I need to
Yeah.
back myself more. Like,
Yeah.
did you give yourself a pep talk? Did you speak to a
Oh, yeah.
mentor? Like, how did you overcome that?
Both of those things for sure. The mentors, definitely. I think having those mentors serve as a really strong reminder of, wait, you have this experience. Like, what are you talking about? These are the things you've done. I've worked with you on this in the past. And then you're like, oh my gosh, you're right. Duh. And then you snap out of it and back to reality. But then there's also the self pep talk where, sometimes it's helped me in the past to almost like write lists of what are the things that you've done that you're proud of, and remembering that I've succeeded in certain things and I've overcome certain obstacles, and literally writing them down, reminding myself what those things are. And that has been really helpful too, because I think our brains just tend to forget a lot of the time. And the self sabotage and like the parrot on the shoulder can be so loud sometimes that it almost gives us like temporary amnesia. And we need to just tell the parrot to, chill and go away and have a nap so we can remember all the awesome things that we've done. But yeah, the pep talk, the consulting the mentors, the just not trying not to listen to the voices that are so loud, but also not ignore them entirely, because I do think they're important at times. I think they keep us on our feet.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I was going to ask you about why you think those kind of imposter syndrome voices are important. So when you say they keep you on your feet, are you saying that sometimes actually maybe there is an element of truth in the imposter voice, and you're like, actually, maybe I do need to read up on this, or maybe I do need to just remind myself how I did this previously? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's important to listen so you can make the distinction of which type of voice this is. Is this the knowledge gap voice, or is this the, loud parrot on the shoulder trying to give me amnesia voice?
Yeah. Monkey brain voice.
Monkey brain. Parrot, monkeys, they like to hang out, talk
Yeah,
shit.
jungle animals. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, I completely get what you're saying. I really love this idea that, you just write down what you've achieved. You just say, like, let's just sit with myself for a bit. Let's work out what I've actually done and what the impact of that is for the team or the client or whatever, and be like, I can do this. It's really important.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is really helpful as well is just to look through your portfolio. Be like, oh, I've actually done useful stuff for other humans. Like,
Yeah.
I can do this. Like, I've
Yeah.
literally done it before. So that's,
Something we did at Webflow, which I loved, every person on the team had a hype doc, and it was a way to catalog wins, big and small. And so even down to like you receive a Slack message from a colleague being like, really great job on this thing. You take a screenshot, put it in your hype doc. And it served as such a great way that, like, whenever you're feeling imposter syndrome, or let's say review time rolls around, you can reference it, and it's kind of like a feel good type of mechanism.
I love that idea, the hype doc. I think Rob Hope he's talked about a similar thing, but the opposite. He's called it the graveyard. And it's like all his business ideas that didn't work, and he kind of
Yes, I love
celebrates
that.
that. And it's like this idea of, in the improv scene, like clapping your failures. I think it's like celebrate the wins, celebrate the failures. Either way, they're achievements
Yeah.
in their own right. But I absolutely love this idea of a hype doc. I might make my own hype doc. Nice Friday afternoon activity
You should.
instead of doing client work that is looming over me. But no, that's really nice. Tell me about failure number 3. Struggling with the fact that many companies expected leaders to not be hands-on and in the work.
I don't know if this was an expectation per se, or maybe it's one that I put on myself, self imposed, where I thought that creative directors, leaders. Once you became a leader, you kind of like put your designer hands-on role on the shelf, and then you stepped into a different sort of role. And that was kind of I think the expectation in a lot of the tech companies that I was a leader at. And it bummed me out because I love doing the work and I love being in the work, but there was always this tension of, oh, well, Jess is the team leader and we're the designers. And so, whenever I did dip into the work, sometimes I did feel a tension of like, oh, why is she designing too? Like she has other more important things to be doing. And so there was a lot of the times that sort of tension between myself and the team. And that also plays into, the early days when I was trying to prove myself as a manager and leader and didn't necessarily know how to without being a designer. More recently, I think in the past couple of years, I've gotten back into being more hands-on and leading. So kind of like more of that player coach type role, which I love so much because I love designing, I love making things. And this will sound really cheesy, but like I feel alive when I'm designing and making. That's why I got into it in the first place. And so it kind of taught me a lesson that like I never ever want to abandon that again. Even if I make it to like the very, very, very top ranks of whatever the highest role of designer could possibly be in a company, I never want to stop making. And so I think it's important to, if you are a leader who also wants to be in the work, to just set that expectation with your team off the bat. That way there's no confusion around, oh, well, Jess is managing, but she's also designing. Like, that's weird. Like, you can just nip that in the bud right away. Talk with the team about it. Be like, I'm a designer too. Here's how you can expect to work with me, and just set those expectations off the bat. But yeah, it was a weird several years where, I felt like I wasn't allowed to be designing almost. And it kind of drove me a little mad.
Okay, this is fascinating. So, you use the phrase player coach, which I absolutely love. One of my favorite players, football players, soccer, is this guy called Ryan Giggs, who used to do yoga every day. And the other players were like, this guy's nuts. Why is he doing yoga? What a loser, right? But
Yeah.
actually, of course, as anyone knows, yoga is great for all sorts of different mental health, physical health benefits. And he was one of the oldest playing players to have played in the Premiership. And he was kind of semi-coach, semi-player. And he's just a really interesting character in my head. You wanted to be Ryan Giggs. You still want to be Ryan Giggs. You've still got the legs. You still want to be in the weeds doing the work. And I completely get that, because sometimes there's this expectation that you can do higher leverage things with your time than the client work itself. But I don't know how you feel about this, but I would push back on that idea, because the client work that you do leads to more client work. The client work that you do with your team leads to, I'd imagine, a happier team, because you're super with them, building together. You're hyper aware of problems that they face, of setbacks that they, or team dynamics maybe that are slightly off, that you can kind of sort there and then. You're doing SOPs or like refining things as you go, because you're literally in there doing it, and you're like,
Right.
there's a problem here, we need to fix this now. You can do that. I mean, I don't know, how do you feel about what I've just said there? Do you think like playing is as important as managing, to a certain, like playing and managing, these two terms being differentiated is maybe slightly problematic? I don't know, what do you think?
I mean, I think just piggybacking off of what you were just saying, I think managers have fuller context if they are more involved in the work. And that's not to say they need to be as involved as the other designers on the team, but if they're so far removed from the actual creating, like, and I can speak this from experience, like it's really hard to get the full picture and the full context of what the team is going through within like the day-to-day doing of the work. And so, yeah, that completely resonates with me. I will also say that something, this plays into the failure part of it. I was so removed from being hands-on making that I didn't learn newer tools fast enough. And that's something that, like Figma, for example. So when Figma first came on the scene, when was it? Like 2018-ish? 17, 18, or 18. I was working at Cloudflare. I was leading the brand design team then. And we were still designing for the most part in Illustrator in Sketch. We made the transition into Figma, but it took me up until like, I want to say last year to get really good at the tool. And I felt very behind because my teams were, slinging in Figma and they were so fast and I was just like, and that's when some of my imposter syndrome would come up too. I'm like, how can I call myself a designer anymore when I can't design in Figma? It was like this huge like insecurity that I had. But then I was like, wait, just learn Figma and stop beating yourself up about it. And so I did. And I don't know, that's something though, when I reflect, I'm like, I should not have waited to do that. And now I'm trying to be more cognizant of new tools popping up that I think are relevant for me and my skill set and making sure I spend time learning them.
Okay, so this is the knowledge gap imposter syndrome where you were just
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't have the skill and I do want to learn this skill. So you went and did it, but you took action, which is really important. I think the anxiety often comes from the lack of doing rather than the
Yeah.
realization of, some lack or need. Can I ask you about what you think the highest leverage things a leader can do in an organization? Because you talked about, being involved, but not so involved that you're doing literally the things that maybe, the designers in your team are doing. But like,
Mm-hmm.
where's the highest leverage and what's the perfect balance of
Mm.
being involved in the creative, but then also kind of looking from, a 10,000-foot view and kind of swapping between those two modes?
That's such a good question. Highest leverage. I would say it depends on a few things because I've experienced multiple different factors that have impacted where I found I needed to have the most leverage. If your team is completely stacked from a talent standpoint, which it was at Webflow, the highest leverage places for me were to make sure that everyone knew what they were working on at any given point and to make sure that the goals of the team were as closely aligned as possible to the goals of the business and helping to kind of steer the ship in that way. So I wasn't as hands-on in the design work at Webflow because I felt like I hired the best possible designers I could possibly hire and I wanted to get out of their way and let them do their thing. Where I would step in is if the team had so much work and their workload was overflowing, I would step in and be a pair of hands and help with the workload. But aside from that, I'd be like, all right, here's the vision, here's the objectives that we're trying to meet for the company, and making sure that stakeholders and leaders who are involved in the feedback process had visibility, that they were able to weigh in their feedback, that they were happy with the work. So it was a lot of like customer relationships, customer management, strategic goal setting, and making sure that the work that the team was doing was the highest quality. Like we were surpassing the bar over and over and over again. And so, yeah, that was what it was like at Webflow. At other companies, like at Cloudflare, I kind of flexed between the projects I was hands on with and not. And that, as my team grew and I was able to bring on talented people, I again, like, I just love hiring super talented designers and letting them do what they're good at. And so with that, I'm like, what does my place as a player coach look like if the team is fully stacked? And how do I inject myself as a designer into that equation? And it's been challenging, I'm not going to lie, especially when that's not the highest leverage place for me to be, if that makes sense, because it's like I'm activating a team of the most talented designers in the world to do the design work, so then I'm called to be doing the things that they can't necessarily do from a leadership standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like the answer isn't as linear as, it's a very simple
Mhm.
question, but actually it's a
Yeah,
very complex, nuanced answer depending on the skill sets of your team, the size of the organization, the expectations from above. Are you
right.
at the top of the ladder or are you, in a chain of command? Can I ask you, from the perspective of someone that's listening, maybe they're an agency owner, maybe they're an employee at an agency, they are kind of trying to transition from being a player to a manager. And they're maybe in this
Hmm.
like weird player manager state, because I think maybe that's the most relatable to anyone that's listening. What steps do they need to think about to transition from being someone that's just doing the work all the time to someone that's managing the work and making more strategic decisions that they might perceive as higher leverage to get where they want to go if they hypothetically want to grow an agency?
I would say just being strategically aligned to the objectives and making sure that your team understands them very clearly and what they're designing for, what the goals are. There's a big difference in being a designer peer to someone on the team to so switching from a peer to a leader, and you're still sharing the same, attributes as your peer when you're hands on, but you're also doing things that are different and trying to like steer the work. A lot of times it means creative direction if you're playing that role, steering the team in a creative and design direction type of way to make sure that you're hitting the objectives of the client.
Love that answer. But what if someone said to you, Jess, I don't want to let go of, I've controlled this thing. This is my baby. The client work is my baby. I know that there's higher leverage things that maybe I should be spending my time doing, but I don't like organizing as much as maybe I need to in order to do that. But how do they let go of the design maybe as much as they might need to in order to free up time for higher leverage things, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think that's an important thing to listen to because, and maybe this plays into the expect. For a while, I think this has changed recently, and I think more people have become aware to this. But for a while, and at least for me, I always thought that the clear path after becoming a designer is you become a design manager and then a creative director and then VP of creative or whatever. But some people, they get to the manager level and they're like, wait, I actually don't like managing people and I don't like organizing time and I don't like doing all of the logistical non-making stuff. And that's a really important thing to listen to because if you don't like doing that, then it's okay to stick to the just making part. I love this is going to make me sound like a masochist, but I love doing a million different types of things. Like I love designing and I love, I love the creative operations part of it. Like I love building relationships with stakeholders and other leaders, and I love strategic goal setting, and I like doing a lot of those different types of things, but that's not for everyone. And so I think it's important to listen to that.
I love that answer because I was worried you were going to be like, well, you've just got to choose.
Just
It's
gotta
like
do it
this,
anyway.
this is what you need to do to
Yeah.
grow $1 million agency. And you're like, no, well, actually listen to that. Just sit with that for a bit because maybe you actually want to do the creative. Maybe you actually want to do that. And I spoke to, Tim and Dan from Make Build Studio, a studio in London recently, and they were like, yeah, we really enjoy doing the creative and we wanted our agency to be a business which we actually wanted to have fun in the day to day. And they were like, we didn't really want to hire a team, even though, we were really busy and maybe we
Yeah.
could have got more money or, projects if we were to build a team and accept those projects, but we didn't really want that wasn't where they wanted to play. And I think that's such an important thing to say because I think a lot of the time the metric for success is, it's like a Daft Punk song. It's like harder, bigger, better, faster, stronger.
Yeah.
And it's like that doesn't necessarily lead to, or you might realize that what you thought was your metric for success actually isn't. And I think, frankly, that is the ultimate failure, is to reach the zenith of what you thought your zenith was, to get to the top of whatever mountain you thought success looked like, and then be like, is this it? Okay, well, I'm going to head back down. So
Yeah, it's so important to do that soul searching and like thinking about what success means for you. And I think a lot of that is thinking back on the times where you felt most fulfilled at work. Sometimes, a lot of the times it's monetary success, which is fine and great. Sometimes it's not. And for the non-monetary successes, I think it's super important to just soul search and identify what those are for you.
yeah. And for anyone that's listening that's like, Jess, Jack, money is important. Don't say that money's not. And I think it's important to say that, well, for me, I can't speak for you, Jess, but yes, I do think that money is important. But I think a lot of the time, because it's a very easy metric to measure, it is an overpowering part of the success pie. And some of the saddest people I know, all they have is money. So I think it's just important to say that, yes, it's important, but it isn't necessarily everything for everyone. Jess, are you ready for the final question, the most difficult question of the podcast?
Let's do it.
What is your next failure going to be?
Ooh, that is a spicy one.
Yeah, I put a little bit of Tabasco at the end.
My next failure. I don't know, but I'm really excited to find out.
What a quote that is.
I
Killer
hope it
answer.
comes soon. I hope it comes as soon as possible because now the anticipation's killing me.
Oh no! Well, you're gonna start a new job. So no, I'm joking.
Oh yeah, I'll fail a ton in the next month for sure.
But as you said at the start of this podcast, that is what makes you a great. Well, you didn't say this, but I'm going to say it for you. That is what makes you a great leader, because you embrace failure. And I think, just to summarize the essence of this episode, for me, the biggest takeaway is that the more you can lean into failure and push through those monkey brain feelings of like, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, and embrace failure, take it as lessons to lead you closer to success, then I can't help feeling that it doesn't matter what your next failure is going to be, when your next failure is going to be, you are going to learn, improve, grow, develop, and be an even better leader than you are currently.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm excited for it. I'm ready for the next failure.
I am excited to hear about it when you come back on the Webflow podcast in a year's time or whatever it is. But Jess, thank you so much for coming on the Webflow podcast and sharing as vulnerably as you have.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.